Hello, I'm Josh Baer, and welcome to the Bear Facts Podcast. On today's episode, we sit down with Sandy Rauer, founder and president of the Calder Foundation, and also the artist's grandson, to talk about his personal journey fostering his grandfather's legacy and the ways that artist foundations can help people of all backgrounds develop personal connections to great art. This episode is brought to you by David Zwerner. They also have a podcast, Dialogues. Give it a listen after this episode. We'll start with, Sandy didn't used to like me. What the hell happened to change your mind?
I discovered you were the son of Joe Bear.
The son of Joe Bear. We're going to get to like a little advice for,
Oh, God.
all that. So it's torture there. So what is an artist foundation as opposed to an artist estate? How do all those things work in general versus just Calder, please?
Well, everything's unique. I don't know, like every artist estate and every artist foundation has its own issues and criteria and circumstances and history. There isn't a formula. It used to be that an artist would die and they might mention in their will to create a foundation for the arts or something, some general statement. Warhol, when he died, he left his entire estate, because he didn't have any kids, to a foundation for the visual arts, very broad responsibilities, right?
Well, we hear the word foundation all the time now in the art world, and it's getting a lot of fuss. And De La Cruz Foundation, all these big collectors foundation. Let's start with what a foundation actually supposed to be and what it is.
Well, I guess you could say there may be two kinds of foundations. There's the artist legacy kind of foundations, and then there are the collectors foundations, the foundations where somebody collects a whole bunch of work and puts them in a foundation in the public sphere. Now there's been some press about some of those foundations being dissolved and the collections being sold. That money still remains in the public sphere. It still goes to whatever the charitable purpose is, even if the art is sold.
So it starts with a tax ramification for charity. Foundation.
No. Let's stick with the artist legacy foundations, because that's what we do here. So when my grandfather died in 1976, there was no concept of an artist legacy foundation. They didn't exist. The only things that existed in those times were like a house where an artist had lived, or that became like a place you could visit.
I mean, like the Pollock House kind of thing.
Exactly. And that was just like offloaded to university to kind of take care of it or try and figure out what to do. It wasn't about the artist's contribution to society. It's just like a place you could go step on his paint drips. Now you can't step on the paint drips, but when you and I were kids, you could just walk all over that place in dirty shoes. Remember?
I do remember. So legacy is an interesting term also. So how do you even define legacy now versus 50 years ago?
Well, the real difference now in the last 25 years is that artists of a certain amount of success have realized that they need to pay attention to what happens when they're gone. So Ellsworth Kelly, way before he died, he started to archive all of his work. I mean, he wrote numbers on the back of his paintings and everything, but he got very serious about archiving them in his late legacy period of his life, like thinking about what's going to happen after he's gone. So he created the foundation, the Kelly Foundation, that's run by his amazing partner, Jack, as a way to create a vessel to hold all that stuff. But he knew what he wanted. He knew that he wanted it to reside in a kind of a vessel. But when I started the Calder Foundation in 1987, there wasn't that kind of concept. There wasn't a map to follow.
So what were the initial goals? Were they about preserving education about the art, preserving the objects, preserving the financial things that came for charitable work? What were the important founding principles back then, 35 years ago? And are they the same now?
No, things have changed for the foundation. But in origin, let's see, I was 24 and I realized that people had no idea what this artist was about, what he was trying to communicate. They thought his art was beautiful and that it moved and it was poetic and it filled the space nicely.
It does all those things.
Yeah, but that doesn't get you anywhere near what the art is. There's no art happening when you're just talking about it as an object, as a thing in space, as something to fill a corner in a room, you know? So in realizing that, I thought, why don't I create first an archive? Like, let's figure out, what did he make, right? Also,
I read once there's 18,000 works.
That was probably a long time ago. You read that because there's like 25,000 works.
Well, I thought of it as interesting. That's a work a day for 50 years.
Yeah, at least. Yeah. He was very prolific. That includes everything in all media, of course, but that is 6,000 sculptures, 6,000 unique sculptures. So that's quite a bit. But his most famous body of work are hanging mobiles, and there are only 1,200 of those. So it used to be somebody would like look at an auction and think, oh, I missed that Calder mobile. I'll just wait till the next auction and there'll be 3 more, as if there were unlimited
Of those
supply.
1,200, how many of them are in museums?
No idea.
As a guess, half?
I don't know. I mean, I could guess half, but I'd be wrong.
How much was he thinking about his legacy?
0.
0. My mother will get to her, and as an artist and an offspring of that, she has no interest in her legacy.
Yeah.
She says.
That's healthy. Well, your mom is a complex character, so who knows what she really is feeling. And those feelings probably change in the...
So are you guessing at what he thought he wanted to happen? Or you know?
Oh, no, I'm certain that he had no concept of anything continuing after his passing. He had no thoughts about that.
But isn't that kind of counterintuitive to the great thing about being an artist is after you're gone, all these things might survive through art history? Isn't that, I'm sure they're thinking of that, and he was aware of maybe having a place in the Jansen's history of art for the next 200 years?
Oh, well, he definitely has that place in Jansen for sure, and Arneson. Yeah, I can tell you for sure that he was not thinking anything about his legacy, his placement, his longevity, any of that stuff. In fact, the reality that his sculpture exists in real time, meaning that it's performative, it's engaging us in real time. It's not just a document, like some ossified thing on a wall, like a painting by an artist that's a frozen moment in time, right? What they were feeling in 1923 and now it's up on the wall. He's not that artist. He's the artist that's projecting into the future a sensation of some kind of aliveness, right? That's what he was doing. He was connecting humans together through this activity. So he definitely kind of postulated that his work would exist in the future and would be active.
I would think, though, I mean, I agree with you in 99.999% of the case. I would say looking at a great Rothko, I can have that experience in its painting and it can be alive, but rarely with most art.
I find Rothko to be tremendously powerful, but a small percentage of them, partially because a lot of them are damaged just through light, taking away their vigor.
Recently I saw a great show of Calder and Clay. It's at Dudona Gallery in New York. Tremendous show, took years to do. Calder's often paired with other artists. Which ones have been most successful as a combination, to your mind?
Well, Calder's not often paired with other artists. This is like something that we started doing with intention. The first one was Calder and Picabia. And I thought that would be a good opener because who's thinking about Calder and Picabia? Who even knew that Calder and Picabia knew each other, like were friends or anything about it? They seem so different as artists. So I wanted to kind of begin there, and that the translucency of both artists I thought was a great subject. Just like with Paul Klee, that inner light that's coming out from Paul Klee is also coming out from Calder. I think that's the overlap. Picabia was definitely something I was very excited about. But the Klee show is something also I've been thinking about for like 30 years, doing a Calder and Klee show, because Klee was influential to Calder in non-obvious ways. I think this show does a pretty good job of explaining about line, even the use of technique, right? Klee is just all over the place, how he's constantly reinventing technique to make these small scale images. And Calder's always reinventing how he is expressing, right, his communication with material, and the way he assembles things changes throughout his life.
Now, the foundation has an enormous team and are very active, at least to my mind, in decisions about every show, every time the work is placed in an exhibition, commercial or public. That's a pretty conscious and more active thing than probably any other artist foundation I've seen.
Well, you were talking about the evolution of the foundation, and the beginning was building an archive and documenting the work. And that goes on a daily basis. We have 5 full-time archivists, which is a lot, We have to also keep up to date with all the new things that are happening with each work of art. So the records continue to evolve in the present time. But the most important activity of the foundation is making exhibitions and making them with a particular viewpoint. Almost every project we're involved with is a single venue, almost all of them. Rarely do we do traveling shows. Our Calder and Picasso show traveled to 5 museums, and that was really an exception.
Just to get a sense of scale, in 35 years, how many shows?
I think I've been instrumental in 116. So around that number. Might be off by 1 or 2.
That's a lot of shows. Any of them one that worked best and one that was the biggest problem, and why?
Well, some of the ones that worked best, the show we did at LACMA was totally spectacular. I think it was like 49 works. It wasn't that many works. You don't think 49 is a big number, but every work was chosen was exceptional work. Stephanie Barron curated that show, and she said, "Oh, I want to ask Frank Gehry to design it." And I was like, "Oh no, that's going to be a disaster. The giant ego of Frank Gehry, that could be really, really terrible." And then Frank worked on it, had zero ego. It was an incredible pleasure. And one of the most gorgeous projects we've ever done was his installation.
By the way, that's one of the reasons that the Guggenheim in Bilbao is great, is that he actually worked for the artist. And almost every architect, and I would bet in many of the shows that the architect or the exhibition designer seems to be working for themselves primary and the artist in a secondary way. So I'm not surprised to hear that, because we've seen that with Gehry.
Well, it's also thematic with us is that we ask the architect of the building often to design a show. I asked Renzo Piano to design the show we did at Santander in Spain because I couldn't conceive of a really good way to use the space. And there's so much glass and looking out at the water, and so, it's kind of beautiful light, but it's not so great to install sculpture in. So I said, "Renzo, solve the problem," which he did. He did a great job.
After the break, we'll hear from Sandy about his path from his childhood as Calder's grandson to starting the foundation, and the foundation's approach to scholarship and request for authentication of Calder's works. This episode of the Bare Facts podcast is brought to you by David Zwirner. Their podcast, Dialogues, is about artists and the way they think, with each episode featuring a conversation with artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians exploring what it means to make things today. Tune in for conversations with artists like Njideka Akunyili-Crosby, Elizabeth Payton, Rikrit Tiravani, and so many more. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Now, how is it to be a family member dealing with it? Would it be different if you were a scholar or a collector? Or how does that work?
If I wasn't in Calder's family, I wouldn't be running the Calder Foundation. I wouldn't be a scholar. I wouldn't be involved with artist legacy. The amazing thing is that I really enjoy my work.
You'd be an astronaut? What would you have been otherwise?
No idea.
What were you on the road to?
No idea. Well, as a kid, I was a practicing artist. I was a photographer. I would probably be a photographer, I would guess. I did that for quite a few years.
Were you encouraged by him and your parents to be an artist?
I was encouraged by everyone in my family to do whatever I was called to do. So it wasn't to be an artist. But they would have totally been happy if I was an artist.
And what are the financial parameters? Not so much about the market, but there's the charitable element that's beyond the education. What else does your foundation do?
Well, we don't make grants. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
We're weird in a number of ways. First of all, there is this whole
you do support artists.
Okay, but that's like smaller. The concept of an artist legacy foundation is one that there's a whole society of them now. They get together, have meetings, have fiestas, talk amongst themselves about all the things that are going on in the world and things that affect us. But our foundation wasn't proposed by Calder. All those other foundations were proposed by the artists. Like the artists had an idea that their legacy needed to be held and preserved. And then what they set about figuring out what they wanted that to look like. Is it like Clifford Still having a big museum with, he kept almost every painting he produced and he made a museum. They made a museum for this legacy. Very, very interesting. I think that's a very interesting result. A big public place with, almost all the work.
I think it would help also if back at the beginning of distinguishing it between what an artist estate might be. And we tend to confuse these two issues. So there was a Calder estate, and that's different than the foundation. What about artist estates in general?
I don't think there's that much confusion because most great artists have a legacy foundation. There's some, like the David Smith estate, never became a foundation. Maybe they've evolved into one now, but they've always been just an estate, meaning the people who received his legacy opened an office and started an archive, and it's not like a public charity.
Is there a threshold you would suggest to artists, like if you have so much work or so much this, whether to even go down this route? You must get calls like, what should I do? Or the children or grandchildren, what should we do? What's the advice you give?
Well, there's so much conflict. If you have a family and the family needs to be supported, there's just so much possible conflict. It's very complicated. I must always say, don't make a foundation.
Because
Well, because there's nobody who's going to devote those 60 hours a week and all their money to building the thing, right? Most of the family wants to take money from an estate, not leave the money in the estate to realize a legacy.
yet you've done that for 35 years. How'd that happen?
I'm weird.
Well, that's why we're here, but weird is good. I mean, I think it would be accurate if every situation is different. Obviously, I'm thinking a little bit, my mom is 95. I don't know what she'll do with the art. And there's 150 paintings, not, how many did you just say? 14 million?
Yeah.
Something like that. So it's a different kind of thing. And we don't have a very good archive. So your advice is first, get all the information of all the works.
Having an archive is key no matter what you're going to do. Yeah. It's key if you're going to run an estate and be responsible. It's key if you're dealing with the copyrights of an artist. It's key if you're dealing with the creation of a foundation, any of those things. You always need to have an archive.
And certainly the internet has changed how this works, from old days of catalog raisonnés that are printed books to online catalog raisonnés.
I still like books,
So like books.
but we're not publishing a catalog raisonné.
What about authentication issues?
What about them?
Do you do them?
Do we do issues?
Do you solve issues? Do you make issues? A lot of foundations and estates have stopped doing it because the liability, especially for expensive art, is astronomical.
It is. It's a big challenge. But we have an open door. We look at things for people. Anybody can bring us almost anything. Since the beginning, since 87, we've had this like policy that we should look at everything that anybody has to see what it is. We can learn something.
And if you don't think it's real, do you cross it out on the back of it?
No, we don't mark people's work. We don't seize it. We don't mark it. We tell them, in our opinion, we don't think Calder made this.
Have you ever been litigated for saying, I don't think that was a Calder?
No. We've had litigation for other things like not wanting to look at a work of art.
Because
We just didn't want
that
to.
was my client. Wait a second. That was us. No,
No, it wasn't.
it wasn't.
That was a case which we won. We got an amazing result, which assisted all of the Artist Legacy Foundations because the judge said the Calder Foundation is not obligated to look at anything for anybody.
I think what's interesting also is judges have ruled, listen, they might think it's not real. That doesn't mean the whole world doesn't think it's not real.
That's why we say it's our opinion.
Right. In reality, though, the market will dictate. If the Warhol Estate Foundation said that's not good, I'm not asking about Calder. They've said, wow, the mine's worthless. And there may not be legal truth to that, but there's practical truth to that. I've noticed you're actively searching out fakes, though. And I think that's good.
Well, I'm actually searching at everything. It's not just fakes. I'm interested in everything. There's still things we can learn. There are shows that happened in the 30s and the 20s that we don't have much documentation on. There's much we can learn.
And in the last few years, people have come in with works that were legitimate that you didn't know about.
Very rare.
Very
But
rare.
yeah, it can happen.
And your records are pretty strong with like, oh, it was in that show in 1941 in Nice. Or
Oh my God, our records are so fabulous. So we'll have we'll still have the attendance book from a show like Brazil in 1948. Everybody who came to the show signed this book and happily and said, great, Calder this and that. And so when somebody says, oh, here's a sculpture, what can you tell us about it? We said, well, what's its history? And they say, oh, well, Calder made it for my grandparents in 1946 in Rio de Janeiro. And we're like, are you sure it's 1946? And I'm like, oh, absolutely, 1946. And in fact, Calder didn't arrive until 48. And we know when he arrived, we know what vessel he was
And
on.
whether Grandpa signed the book when he went in to see the show.
Yeah, well, he didn't sign the book because he wasn't a guest.
No, their grandpa, not
Oh,
yours.
yeah, their grandpa. Yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot of grandpas in there. I've seen some of these records. They're pretty detailed. So when someone comes at you, in that sense, is it the foundation's available? I'm thinking about museums lately, and they used to be a place that scholars would go. They make an appointment. They go in the basement, and they look at the Rothko. They look at the Calder. That seems to be gone for museums, would you say?
To visit works from the storage?
Or to make it, yes. So that some things in the collection of MoMA, you want to go, you're a curator from Nebraska, and I want to go see that Picabia that you have in the 50s. They'd make an appointment, you come in, they'd pull it out, and you'd look at it and study it, right? That's one of the main features. The beginning of museums in America was to do that, right?
Well, that still happens.
No, but it happens here, right?
Well, I don't know. I found every door to be open to us. If we want to go see a work at MoMA or anywhere.
Sure, but I would say the general purpose of the museums as educational institutions.
Oh, doing scholarship.
Has really changed to, you were talking about the performance of the objects. It's sort of the performance of the institution as entertainment. You did a great project with TR Lab that was kind of unusual and in the digital age. Could you tell us about that project?
We weren't trying to make millions of dollars from NFTs. We were trying to see how this new medium could be an educational platform. Young people have a different viewpoint than I have. It's really quite different. And when TR Lab approached us to do the NFTs, I was really fascinated by their brilliance, highly intelligent people. I was especially concerned, will we be able to access those same kind of people? That community that's very, very bright, that lives on screens a lot, but they're really intelligent. It turned out it was mostly people like in their 20s who studied Calder, took a test and passed the test in order to get to the point where they could buy an NFT. You had to go through that cycle to be able to buy the NFT. You didn't have to buy the NFT, but we got a lot of very smart people learning about Calder, trying to understand what was Calder's achievement. I think that was super successful.
Stay with us in a moment as Sandy shares the secret to creating the greatest exhibitions he's worked on through the foundation, and how Calder became the first truly international artist. This episode of the Bare Facts podcast is brought to you by David Zwerner. Their podcast, Dialogues, is about artists and the way they think, with each episode featuring a conversation with artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians exploring what it means to make things today. Tune in for conversations with creatives from Luca Guadagnino to Sofia Coppola to Hilton Alls and so many more. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Tell us about Calder in terms of outdoor sculpture. I think many more people probably know the outdoor sculpture in the world than anything else, right?
No, I think people know his hanging mobiles the most. Sometimes I'll be in a place and I'll talk about Calder, this artist, and I sort of play shy and I say, well, my grandfather was an artist, an American artist, a sculptor, da-da-da.
Are you trying to tell me you went to Harvard, Sandy?
No, I didn't go to Harvard. I didn't go to college. But I sort of proposed that Calder was this American artist in case you've never heard of him. And then a lot of people, of course, have heard of him, but some people haven't heard of him. So I have to say his work is like those mobiles in museums. Of course they know the mobiles.
I was
in
thinking
museums.
the outdoor sculptures, they would know the best.
I don't think so. I don't think people who walk by public plazas know who made those sculptures. So you're an insider, Josh. You grew up in the art world. Your mom's an artist. You know the streets of Soho. You know which one goes up and which one goes down. You're a rare breed.
Well, that's why I assume that people would know what they pass on the street more than what they saw at Lincoln Center or at MoMA.
What about the Calder at Lincoln Center? Do you know there's a Calder at Lincoln Center? Do you know its title?
Sandy's Special. What's the title?
It's called Le Guichet, which is the ticket window in French, 1965. And it's got this weird sort of round triangular hole. And it was a pre-existing sculpture that the Lippmann family bought and gave to Lincoln Center in 65.
Tell us about the garden in Philadelphia.
The people who built the new Barnes Foundation, I can say new, but the Barnes Foundation in City Center, like moved it to City Center, approached us about doing a project in Philadelphia. And I didn't want to do a hometown Calder museum. I just thought that wasn't a good idea. How can I continue the work of the foundation, which is furthering Calder's communication? How can we utilize that in bricks and mortar place or cast concrete, as the case may be? And our partners in Philadelphia understood what I was talking about, that, a kind of a sanctuary, a place where you can go, where people can go and see art that's not a museum, like taking it out of the 19th century model of hermetically sealed objects. You know how museums like push you away by putting things behind glass or push you farther and farther from the art, and how the sculptures can't be alive in a space because of all the reasons they can't be. So I proposed doing a place that was kind of a journey, a series of spaces where you engage the work, you see the work. It's not an exhibition. There's no didactic text. It's not a learning center. It's a place to go and be with the art and maybe have an introspective experience. Maybe, learn something more about yourself.
Pivoting from there makes me question the white cube of the gallery and how that's used in the last, I don't know, it's 60 or 70 years. Are you trying to get away from that experience too? You work with a lot of galleries.
Well, we work in a lot of spaces. We just opened a show in Lugano at Massi, and it's one long rectilinear space with a glass at the end, looks out over the water. Difficult space, very difficult space for sculpture.
But the galleries are pretty much white boxes these days. Do you find, as you look forward, that we might start to move away from that a little bit?
One would hope. We usually transform a space when we do it. If we do an important show, we transform a space. Even at Dodona, that show, the Clay and Calder show, Emmanuel organized the show in a beautiful way. There's transparency in some of the walls. There's form and there's movement in the space. There are all these dark colors, which are, I think, really good for this historic art that he's showing. But the Philadelphia project is designed by Jacques Herzog. And I told Jacques at the beginning, I wasn't really sure, what's this Pritzker Prize winning architect going to come up? Is he going to come up with something original, unique, special, appropriate to the task, which is don't make a museum, make a place for art that's not a museum? And he's done a brilliant job. The heavy lifting's almost done. All the cast concrete is almost finished. It's going to be open next year. But you really feel like it's a human space, not the kind of anti-human space, not the big space.
As I've been traveling the globe more and more, particularly in Asia, I've started to realize that maybe art doesn't mean the same thing every place. That a Calder in Saudi Arabia might have a different sense than people in Beijing, or that each of us bring our experiences. We've been very Western-centric. Over all these years, you've had many more global experiences. What about the global reaction to Calder, and how is it different? And part two would that be sort of generational. What have you learned about all these experiences between the locale, the viewer, and the age of the viewers?
Well, the first thing is about Calder being a global artist. And he was probably the first totally international artist because he was traveling between continents for commissions for major works on an airplane. Right? His first trip in an airplane was over the Atlantic at the end of the war in 45, 46. He's traveling back and forth on an airplane. When you arrive the same day you leave, totally amazing, not 3 to 6 weeks on the ocean. His work, because it has no prescribed meaning, it's open for interpretation. And culturally, there are different interpretations for sure. And that's all acceptable. That's all part of it.
Back to the generational thing, you have how many kids, what age to what age, and how different are they in this conversation with experiencing art and Calder's art?
I have 4 kids. They're from 9 to 34 years old. They're growing up differently than I grew up, but they have access to beautiful art like I did when I was a kid. So I'm very happy about that. They don't live all their lives on screens.
Yeah, well, I lost that battle. So any final words for the Barefax podcast listeners? What are, in my mind, are important things like the future and the legacy of artists and how to really study these things. Anything you'd like to say as we go out on this?
I hope that scholarship evolves but that it doesn't die. I think scholarship is so important for us to be able to understand a time, be able to look back. Like I study the period between the Great War and the war. Yeah, that's World War I and World War II. I think that time is really fascinating culturally in the West. And a lot of art that was created at that time is art that I personally resonate with, that I find very beautiful and like heart achingly rich for me. And the people who are in their 20s don't know who Paul Klee is. So the show, Klee and Calder, they go to see the Calder. They don't like, people that are our age or older than us, they go to see the Klees because they know Klee is this amazing genius and amazing image maker. And Dodonna has gotten some incredible Klees together for the show. So it's really worth it. But it's so kind of staggering to me that Calder's the more famous artist these days than Klee. Klee was a giant in his time and in Calder's time. So scholarship needs to continue.
Do you ever think of yourself or refer to yourself as curator? That's a loaded term that's used a little too often, I think, in the art world.
That's fine. I've curated many things. I have no degrees, didn't go to university. I had no use for higher education, but everyone else should go to university, but I chose not to when I was 8. I just thought I had a life to lead and started doing stuff. When I made the foundation at 24, it was out of seeing that there was a need, and I was willing to dedicate myself to it. I really felt that my grandfather had been so, not just generous to me, which he certainly was, but to all of us. I think his achievement was something that I wanted to recognize and participate with and help to give breath to.
Now, maybe to finish up with the foundation, it's like, I often ask this, what do you wish you knew then that you know now? And what have you learned now from 40 years of it that you're surprised to have discovered?
When I started, I started with no money. So it wasn't endowed. It wasn't that Calder left a lump of money and a lump of art, right? I started it from zero. So
that probably wasn't a good idea that you didn't realize at the time.
It was okay. My family supported me in it and things worked. I think I was right at the beginning to make sure that it's always evolving. I think that's why I can still come to work every day, because the foundation, not just the shows are constantly new, exciting ventures, but that as an institution, our priorities shift and change and our responsibilities become, more apparent, things we didn't know before. Many of my employees have worked for me for 10 and 20 years. I think that's really fun.
Sandy, thank you. We look forward to seeing
Pleasure.
all these projects. Thank you for having us to the foundation. And Sandy meant to say, don't transact without the bare facts.
I love that.
While we were finishing up my conversation with Sandy, I asked our colleague, Luyang Jiang, executive producer of our podcast, who was with us via Zoom, if she had any additional questions. She shared a personal story of her encounter with one of Calder's sculptures while she was a student at UC Berkeley.
I was an undergrad student at the business school at UC Berkeley. Along Bancroft Way on the east side of the campus, there was a huge black sculpture that I passed by every day on my way to class. At that time, I didn't study art and knew nothing about this piece. But over time, I started feeling this strange connection to it, like it was trying to tell me something. So I started researching the artwork and the artist behind it. And that's how I discovered Calder and learned the name of the sculpture, the Hawk for Peace. Fast forward 20 plus years, I've seen Calder's works all over the world, but still, the Hawk for Peace holds a special place in my heart, not only as a witness to a key moment in my personal journey, but also as one of my first encounters with that world of art.
It's really fascinating because you were trying to find meaning in the object, as opposed to recognizing you were having an experience with the sculpture. You were by it every day. You said you walked by it. And that kind of intimate experience of it being part of your life on a daily basis is exactly what Calder was about. That's exactly what he was trying to achieve, especially in his public sculpture. But he also, anticipated that every sculpture is going to be in people's homes. It wasn't like now that it's only in wealthy people's homes. It was, supposed to be in lots of people's homes. And that sculpture was originally called Boeing, not after the airplanes. It was like this idea of having buoyancy and of course, it's at the time of the Vietnam War. It's very much like now, right? We have this extraordinary moment we're in, and totally extraordinary moment. And Calder was adamantly against the Vietnam War, and he donated that sculpture to Berkeley because his sister was there, and was on the board of the museum and stuff. She lived in Berkeley, and he donated it in honor of her husband and called it the Hawk for Peace because it looks, to some people, it looks sort of like a bird, like a hawk. Of course, it's not an abstraction of a hawk. Calder's not an abstract artist. He didn't take known images and convert them into abstract forms. He just created forms out of his own intuitive process. So the Hawk for Peace, he was saying, maybe this is a moment on the campus of Berkeley to have some reference for a positivity of humanity, but not a propaganda, right? He said, my work has no propaganda value. So it wasn't trying to have some sort of statement, anti-government statement or anything. It was just more of like a hopeful human gesture. I love that you had that experience of being around that sculpture.
I'm so glad to share my personal story about Calder with you. I'm also curious, though, how would you like people to think about your grandfather as an artist and his works?
The weird thing about Calder is he's a difficult artist. Everybody thinks they understand Calder because it's so apparently immediately accessible, when actually it's not. So those other things, color, form, movement, right? The choreography of it draw you in and you think you're having this gratifying experience. But you really have to sit with his work. The whole Philadelphia project is about making the possibility to sit on a bench and be with a work for an hour or longer for whatever time scale you want. And it's about opening yourself up, being present to it. What we really don't want to have is somebody tell you what the meaning is. Calder said his work doesn't have any meaning, which makes it very difficult. Then you have to bring meaning yourself. And to feel, to be self-possessed enough to be able to come to art and say, I'm now going to engage with what is the meaning of this experience, right? Not the metal, but what the experience is, the body and the work together in a space, what that experience is something that gives a chance for an opening, a chance for a kind of evolution.
We'd like to give a big thank you to Sandy for joining us as our guest for this episode of the Bear Faxed podcast, brought to you by David Zwerner. Our host is Josh Baer. Our executive producer is Luyang Jiang. Our content strategist is Boliang Shin. I'm Will Griffith, our associate editor, and our editing team is Mona Productions. Subscribe today wherever you get your podcasts, and check back soon for future episodes as we unpack the inner workings of the global art industry through exclusive, candid interviews with key players in the business as they offer their perspectives on art and the market in the US, Europe, Asia, and beyond.